The dusty trail stretched endlessly before Thomas McClure as his horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. 3 years had passed since he'd left his ranch in Arizona Territory, and every mile brought him closer to home. The weight of the gold coins in his saddlebags reminded him of the fortune he'd made in the California goldfields, enough to expand his ranch and provide well for his 2 Apache wives, Morning Star and Silent River. Thomas had married both women according to Apache custom during his early years as a trader. Morning Star, the daughter of a respected war chief, had taught him the ways of her people and helped him establish peaceful relations with the local tribes. Silent River, gentle and wise, had become his anchor during the difficult early years when drought threatened his cattle, and hostile settlers questioned his choices. Both women had given him children. Morning Star bore him 2 sons, and Silent River had a daughter who would be nearly walking by now. The landscape began to look familiar as he crested a small hill. The cottonwoods along Willow Creek came into view, and his heart quickened with anticipation. He'd written letters to his brother Samuel, who had been managing the ranch in his absence, telling him of his success and his planned return. Samuel had written back only once, mentioning that all was well and the cattle were thriving. As Thomas rode closer to his property, something felt wrong. The fence posts looked newer, painted white instead of the weathered gray he remembered. A large wooden sign had been erected near the main gate, reading, McClure Cattle Company, Samuel McClure, Proprietor. Thomas pulled his horse to a stop, staring at the sign with growing confusion and anger. There was no mention of his name, despite the fact that he was the original owner and had left Samuel in charge temporarily. He spurred his horse forward, riding hard toward the main house. As he approached, he saw significant changes. The house had been expanded with a new wing added to the east side. Fresh paint covered the exterior, and new curtains hung in the windows. Several cowboys he didn't recognize worked in the corrals, and expensive-looking horses grazed in the near pasture. Thomas dismounted near the front porch, his spurs jingling as he walked up the steps. Before he could knock, the door opened and Samuel emerged, his face turning pale at the sight of his brother. Samuel had grown stout in the 3 years since Thomas had seen him, wearing expensive clothes and sporting a gold watch chain across his vest. "Thomas," Samuel stammered, clearly unprepared for this moment. You're early. I wasn't expecting you for another month." "I finished my business sooner than planned," Thomas replied, his voice steady but cold. "I see you've made some improvements to my ranch." Samuel's eyes darted nervously. "Yes, well, the cattle business has been very good. I thought you'd be pleased with the expansion." Thomas stepped closer, studying his brother's face. "Where are Morning Star and Silent River?" "Where are my children?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Samuel's face flushed red and he looked away, unable to meet his brother's gaze. "Thomas, there have been complications. The territorial government has been cracking down on mixed marriages. There was pressure from the new settlers, complaints about Indians on the property." "What did you do, Samuel?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "I had to make a choice," Samuel said, his voice rising defensively. "It was either get rid of them or lose everything to the territorial authorities. They were going to seize the ranch, claim it was harboring hostiles." Thomas grabbed Samuel by the shirt, pulling him close. "What did you do to my wives?" "Where are my children?" Samuel struggled in his brother's grip. "They're gone, Thomas. I sent them back to the reservation. It was for the best. You can understand that, can't you? A white man can't be married to Indian women, not anymore. The territory is civilizing." Thomas released his brother so suddenly that Samuel stumbled backward. "You sent them away? My wives, my children? Without my permission? You were gone for 3 years." Samuel shouted back. 3 years, Thomas. I had to make decisions. I had to keep this place running. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed to build this ranch into something respectable?" "Build what?" "This is my ranch, Samuel. I left you in charge, not as owner." Samuel's expression hardened. "Is it? Where's your deed, Thomas? Where's your proof of ownership? Because according to the territorial records, I've been paying taxes on this land for 3 years. I've been the legal owner for 3 years. Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. "What are you talking about?" "I have the original deed in my saddlebags. That old Spanish land grant?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "The territorial government doesn't recognize those anymore. Too many forged documents, too many conflicting claims. I had to file new papers, establish clear ownership under American law. It cost me everything I had saved, but I did it to protect the ranch. To protect it for yourself, you mean? To protect it from being seized, Samuel shot back. Do you think the territorial authorities would have let a man married to 2 Apache women keep a ranch this size? You were living in a dream, Thomas. I saved what I could. Thomas walked to his horse and pulled out a leather portfolio from his saddlebags. Inside were the original Spanish land grant documents, yellowed with age but clearly establishing his ownership of the property. He also had his marriage certificates performed according to Apache custom and witnessed by tribal elders. These documents are legal, Thomas said, holding them up. Not anymore, Samuel replied. The territorial legislature passed new laws while you were gone. Mixed marriages aren't recognized. Spanish land grants need to be refiled under American law within a specific time frame. That time frame expired 18 months ago. Thomas stared at his brother, beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. You knew this would happen. You planned this. I adapted to circumstances, Samuel said. I did what I had to do to preserve something from the mess you left behind. The mess I left behind? I left behind a profitable ranch, 2 loving wives, and 3 children. I left behind a life. You left behind problems, Samuel countered. Problems that would have destroyed everything. At least this way, part of the McClure legacy survives. Thomas looked around at the ranch he'd built from nothing, now transformed into something he barely recognized. Where exactly on the reservation did you send them? The San Carlos reservation. They're safe there, Thomas. The government provides food and shelter. Thomas had heard enough about San Carlos to know it was more like a prison than a home. The Apache people there were struggling, confined to barren land with inadequate resources. The thought of Morning Star and Silent River, proud women who had helped him build this ranch, now reduced to dependency on government handouts, filled him with rage. I'm going to get them back, Thomas said quietly. It won't work, Samuel replied. Even if you could bring them back, you can't legally marry Indian women anymore. You have no rights to this property. The best thing you can do is accept reality and move on. Thomas mounted his horse, looking down at his brother one last time. We'll see about that, Samuel. We'll see. As he rode away from the ranch, Thomas's mind raced with plans and possibilities. He had gold, he had determination, and most importantly, he had love for his family. Samuel might have legal documents and territorial law on his side, but Thomas had something more powerful. The absolute certainty that he would not rest until his family was reunited and his property restored. Thomas rode hard toward the town of Copper Creek, his mind churning with anger and determination. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky blood red, which seemed fitting for his mood. He needed legal help, and he needed to understand exactly what had happened while he was away. The town had grown considerably during his absence. New buildings lined the main street, including a proper courthouse, a telegraph office, and several businesses he didn't recognize. Gas lamps flickered to life as darkness fell, giving the place an air of prosperity and civilization that hadn't existed when he'd left. Thomas hitched his horse outside the Frontier Saloon and pushed through the batwing doors. The place was crowded with cowboys, merchants, and settlers. Conversations died as he entered, his dusty trail clothes and grim expression drawing attention. He recognized a few faces from the old days, but most were strangers. Thomas McClure, called out a voice from the back corner. Well, I'll be damned. Thomas turned to see Jake Morrison, an old friend who had helped him in his early ranching days. Jake approached with a mixture of welcome and wariness in his eyes. Jake, Thomas nodded, shaking the man's hand. Good to see you. Heard you were back, Jake said quietly. Word travels fast in a small town. Buy you a drink? They found a table away from the crowd, and Jake signaled the bartender for 2 whiskeys. Thomas noticed how other patrons kept glancing in their direction, whispering among themselves. So, Jake began carefully, I suppose you've been to the ranch. I've been there, Thomas replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Found some interesting changes, Jake nodded grimly. Thomas, I want you to know that some of us tried to speak up. When Samuel started making his moves, when he sent away Morning Star and Silent River, there were folks who thought it was wrong. But you didn't stop him. We couldn't. The territorial authorities backed him. They said he was bringing civilization to the area, getting rid of undesirable elements. Jake leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's more you need to know. Samuel didn't just send your wives away. He sold their personal belongings, including horses that Morningstar had received from her father. He claimed they were stolen property. Thomas's grip tightened on his whiskey glass. What about my children? They went with their mothers to San Carlos. But Thomas, the conditions there are bad. Really bad. Disease, starvation, overcrowding. The government promised supplies that never came. The whiskey burned as Thomas downed it in one gulp. I need to talk to a lawyer. Someone who knows territorial law. There's a new lawyer in town, Henry Blackwood. He's honest, which is more than I can say for most. But Thomas, you should know that Samuel has Judge Patterson in his pocket. Patterson's the one who approved the new land claims and the marriage law changes. Thomas absorbed this information, realizing that his brother's betrayal was more systematic than he'd initially understood. Tell me everything that happened after I left. Jake glanced around nervously before continuing. About 6 months after you left, Samuel started making changes. He said you'd given him power of attorney, though. Nobody ever saw the document. He began hiring new hands, men with questionable reputations. Then the complaints started. What kind of complaints? Neighbors claimed your wives were stealing livestock, practicing witchcraft, harboring hostile Indians. All nonsense, of course, but it gave the territorial government an excuse to investigate. Thomas felt his anger building. Samuel orchestrated those complaints. Can't prove it, but that's what most of us suspected. Samuel started courting the daughter of a wealthy merchant from Phoenix, Margaret Patterson, the judge's niece. Suddenly, he had connections and political backing. He's married, engaged. The wedding's planned for next month. He's been telling everyone that he's built the ranch from nothing, that he's a self-made man bringing prosperity to the territory. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Several patrons looked over and the room grew quieter. Where can I find this lawyer Blackwood? He has an office above the general store. Thomas, be careful. Samuel has sheriff's deputies on his payroll now. Deputy Marshal Crawford is his brother-in-law, married to his fiance's sister. Thomas left the saloon and walked through the quiet streets to the general store. A narrow staircase on the side of the building led to the second floor, where a small sign read Henry Blackwood, attorney at law. Light glowed in the window, suggesting the lawyer worked late hours. Thomas knocked on the door and was greeted by a man in his 30s, well-dressed but not flashy, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Mr. Blackwood? I'm Thomas McClure. I need legal representation. Blackwood's eyes widened slightly. Thomas McClure. I wondered when you'd show up. Please come in. The office was small but organized, with law books lining the walls and papers neatly arranged on a large desk. Blackwood poured coffee from a pot on a side table and gestured for Thomas to sit. I assume this is about your property dispute with your brother. It's not a dispute. He's stolen my ranch and driven away my family. Blackwood pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. I've been following the situation, Mr. McClure. I had hoped you would return before matters proceeded this far. Thomas leaned forward. Can you help me get my property back? That's complicated. Your brother filed new ownership papers under the Homestead Act while you were absent. He claimed the property was abandoned and that he had been improving it with his own resources. I left him in charge temporarily while I pursued business in California. That doesn't constitute abandonment. According to territorial law, absence for more than 2 years without notification to local authorities can be interpreted as abandonment, especially if someone else is actively working and improving the land. Thomas felt his hopes beginning to fade. What about my original land grant? Spanish land grants are still valid if they were properly registered under American territorial law, within the specified time frame. Unfortunately, that deadline passed while you were away. Samuel knew about the deadline? Blackwood nodded grimly. He was advised of it by the Territorial Land Office. There's correspondence in the file indicating he was specifically told when the deadline would expire. So he deliberately let it pass. It appears so. However, there may be legal avenues we can pursue. The power of attorney he claimed to have from you, if it can be proven fraudulent, it might invalidate some of his actions. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out several documents. I never gave him power of attorney. These are the only legal documents I signed before leaving. Blackwood examined the papers carefully. This is helpful. We can challenge the validity of his ownership claim based on fraud. But Mr. McClure, I must warn you that this will be expensive and time-consuming. Judge Patterson has been favorable to your brother's interests. Money isn't a problem, Thomas said, thinking of the gold in his saddlebags. What about my wives? Is there any legal way to bring them back from the reservation? Blackwood's expression grew even more serious. That's more complicated. The territorial government has specific policies regarding mixed marriages. However, if we can prove that your wives were legally married to you before the law changed, and that they were unlawfully removed from their home, we might have grounds for a civil rights case. You'd be willing to take on a case involving Apache wives? Mr. McClure, I believe in justice regardless of race or politics. But I should warn you that taking on this case could damage my practice and put both of us at risk. Samuel has powerful friends now. Thomas stood and extended his hand. Mr. Blackwood, I'll pay whatever it costs and face whatever risks are necessary. Those women are my wives, those children are mine, and that ranch belongs to me. I won't let my brother's greed and prejudice stand. Blackwood shook his hand firmly. Then we have work to do. I suggest you find somewhere safe to stay tonight. Word of your return has already spread, and Samuel won't want you stirring up trouble. As Thomas left the lawyer's office, he felt the weight of the challenge ahead. His brother had spent 3 years building political connections and legal protections. Samuel had territorial law, corrupt officials, and social prejudice on his side. But Thomas had something more powerful: the absolute certainty that he was fighting for his family and his rightful property. The moon was rising over the mountains as Thomas walked back toward his horse, unaware that 2 men in the shadows had been watching the lawyer's office, taking note of everyone who entered and left. Thomas decided to spend the night camping outside town rather than risk staying at the hotel where Samuel's allies might cause trouble. He found a secluded spot near Willow Creek, the same stream that ran through his stolen ranch property. As he sat by his small campfire, listening to the water flow over rocks, memories flooded back of better times with Morningstar and Silent River. He remembered how Morningstar would wake before dawn to tend the horses, her movements graceful and efficient as she prepared for the day's work. She had been instrumental in establishing trade relationships with Apache bands throughout the territory, using her family connections to ensure safe passage for cattle drives and supply wagons. Silent River, despite her name, had been the storyteller of their family, entertaining their children with traditional tales while teaching them both Apache and English languages. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his thoughts. Thomas quickly doused his fire and moved into the shadows, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces illuminated by moonlight. Thomas recognized one of them as Deputy Marshal Crawford, a thin man with a permanent sneer who had arrived in the territory about a year before Thomas left. "McClure," Crawford called out. "We know you're out there. Come on out and let's have a talk." Thomas remained hidden, studying the situation. The other 2 men weren't wearing badges, and their posture suggested they were more interested in violence than conversation. "What do you want, Crawford?" Thomas called back, keeping his position concealed. "Just want to welcome you home, McClure. Heard you've been visiting lawyers, stirring up trouble. Thought we should have a friendly chat about expectations." "I'm not stirring up trouble. I'm trying to reclaim my stolen property." Crawford laughed harshly. "Stolen? That's a serious accusation. Samuel McClure is one of our most respected citizens. He's contributed more to this territory's development than anyone, using my money and my land. Now see, that's where you're mistaken. Samuel filed proper claims, paid proper fees, improved the property according to law. Everything he's done is legal and documented." Thomas moved carefully through the brush, trying to get a better position. "Legal doesn't make it right. Right and wrong are matters of opinion, McClure. Law is fact. And the law says Samuel owns that property fair and square." One of Crawford's companions spoke up, his voice rough and threatening. "Maybe we should just solve this problem permanent-like." "Easy, boys," Crawford said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. "Mr. McClure here is going to be reasonable." "Aren't you, McClure?" Thomas had heard enough. He stepped out from behind a large boulder, his revolver drawn but pointed downward. "I'm reasonable, Crawford, but I'm not stupid. 3 men riding out to have a friendly chat in the middle of the night doesn't sound reasonable to me." Crawford's hand moved toward his weapon. "Now don't do anything foolish, McClure. We just want to make sure you understand how things work around here now. How things work is that I'm going to get my family back and reclaim my property through proper legal channels. If that threatens you, maybe you should examine why." "Your family?" Crawford laughed mockingly. "You mean those Apache squaws your brother had the good sense to get rid of? The territory's better off without that kind of arrangement." Thomas felt rage building in his chest but kept his voice steady. Those women are my legally married wives, and their children are my sons and daughter. Not according to territorial law. Mixed marriages aren't recognized anymore. Those children are just half-breed bastards now. The insult struck Thomas like a physical blow. His grip tightened on his revolver, but he forced himself to maintain control. Careful, Crawford. You're talking about my family. I'm talking about facts, McClure. And here's another fact. If you keep pushing this legal nonsense, if you keep trying to drag those Indians back here, you're going to find this territory very unhospitable. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. Samuel's engaged to Judge Patterson's niece. He's got business partnerships with half the merchants in Phoenix. He's bringing civilization to this area. You're just a relic from the old days when things were different. Thomas studied the three men, calculating odds and angles. The old days when a man's word meant something? When marriage vows were sacred? When stealing from your own brother would get you horsewhipped? The old days when this territory was lawless and dangerous, Crawford replied. Samuel brought order. He brought progress. He brought corruption. Crawford's patience was clearly wearing thin. Last warning, McClure. Drop this legal challenge, leave the territory, and everyone stays healthy. Keep pushing, and you'll find out that accidents happen to troublemakers. Like they happen to Morningstar's horses? Like they happen to Silent River's personal belongings? Crawford's expression hardened. Those animals were sold to pay debts. The belongings were disposed of as abandoned property. All perfectly legal, all perfectly theft. The tension in the air was palpable. Thomas could sense that Crawford was losing patience with conversation and considering more direct action. The deputy's two companions had spread out slightly, positioning themselves for a potential fight. You know what, McClure? I think this conversation is over, Crawford said, his hand moving toward his gun. Thomas was faster. His Colt was up and aimed before Crawford could clear leather. I think you're right. The three men froze, recognizing that they had miscalculated. Thomas had fought Indians, outlaws, and claim jumpers in his years building the ranch. He was no soft target. Now here's how this is going to work, Thomas said calmly. You're going to turn around and ride back to town. You're going to tell Samuel that his big brother is home, and he's not intimidated by hired thugs or corrupt officials. You're making a big mistake, McClure, Crawford snarled. But he didn't reach for his weapon. The mistake was mine 3 years ago when I trusted my brother. I won't make that mistake again. The three men backed toward their horses, keeping their hands visible. As they mounted, Crawford called out one final threat. This isn't over, McClure. Not by a long shot. No, it's not, Thomas agreed. But next time you come looking for me, come ready for a real fight, not an ambush. The riders disappeared into the darkness, leaving Thomas alone by the creek. He knew the encounter had escalated the conflict, but he also knew that backing down would have solved nothing. Samuel was clearly prepared to use violence to protect what he had stolen, which meant Thomas needed to be prepared to defend himself. As he rekindled his campfire, Thomas made plans for the next day. He would need to visit San Carlos Reservation to find Morningstar and Silent River, to see their condition and let them know he had returned. He would also need to begin gathering evidence of Samuel's fraudulent activities, documenting the theft and seeking witnesses willing to testify. The path ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but Thomas had survived 3 years in California goldfields, dealing with claim jumpers, thieves, and harsh conditions. He had built a ranch from nothing once before, establishing relationships with Apache bands and creating a profitable operation through hard work and fair dealing. Samuel might have legal documents and political connections, but Thomas had something more valuable, the absolute moral certainty that he was fighting for his family and his rightful property. He had gold to hire lawyers and investigators, determination to see justice done, and the skills to protect himself from men like Crawford. As the fire crackled and the creek murmured nearby, Thomas stared up at the stars, thinking about Morningstar and how she used to point out constellations and tell him their Apache names. Somewhere out there, she and Silent River were struggling to survive in conditions far worse than this comfortable campsite. His children were growing up in poverty and confinement instead of learning to ride horses and work cattle on their family ranch. The thought filled him with renewed determination. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight to bring his family home and reclaim what was rightfully his, regardless of the risks or the cost. Thomas rode toward San Carlos Reservation at dawn, his heart heavy with anticipation and dread. The journey would take most of the day, and he had no idea what conditions he would find when he arrived. Reports from other territories suggested that reservation life was harsh, with inadequate food, poor housing, and disease running rampant among the confined Apache people. The landscape grew more desolate as he traveled southeast. The lush grasslands around his ranch gave way to rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. This was land that no white settler wanted, which made it perfect for confining people the government considered problems. By afternoon, Thomas could see the reservation boundaries marked by wooden posts and barbed wire. Guard stations were positioned at regular intervals, manned by soldiers who watched his approach with suspicion. At the main entrance, a sergeant stepped out to intercept him. "State your business," the soldier demanded, his rifle held ready but not directly threatening. "I'm looking for my family. 2 Apache women and their children were sent here from Copper Creek about 2 years ago." The sergeant looked him up and down, taking in his dusty trail clothes and the obvious quality of his horse and equipment. "You're the one they call the Apache husband?" Thomas bristled at the mocking tone. "I'm Thomas McClure. My wives are Morningstar, daughter of Chief Redhawk and Silent River of the Mountain Band. They have my children with them." Well, the sergeant said with a smirk. "The famous rancher who thinks he can marry squaws. You caused quite a stir when they arrived. Had to separate them from some of the other families because of the fighting." "What fighting?" "Some of the reservation Indians didn't take kindly to women who'd been living with whites having better clothes and possessions than everyone else. Of course, that got sorted out real quick when we confiscated anything that looked valuable." Thomas felt his anger rising. "You stole their personal belongings?" "Redistributed resources for the good of the community," the sergeant corrected. "Everyone here lives by the same rules." "I want to see them." The sergeant considered this, clearly enjoying the power he held over the situation. "Visiting hours are limited and you'll need permission from the Indian agent. That's Mr. Daniels. His office is that building over there." Thomas dismounted and walked toward the indicated building, a rough wooden structure that looked like it had been hastily constructed. The sign on the door read, "Bureau of Indian Affairs, Agent Cornelius Daniels." Thomas knocked and entered without waiting for permission. The man behind the desk was thin and pale, wearing a rumpled suit that had seen better days. He looked up from his paperwork with obvious annoyance at the interruption. "Mr. Daniels, I'm Thomas McClure. I'm here to see my family." Daniels set down his pen and studied Thomas with cold, calculating eyes. "McClure, yes, I've heard about you. The man who abandoned his Indian wives and children to chase gold in California. I didn't abandon anyone. I left them in my brother's care while I pursued business opportunities." "And how did that work out for you?" Daniels asked with obvious sarcasm. Thomas ignored the question. "I want to see Morningstar and Silent River immediately." "That's not how things work here, McClure. This is a government facility with rules and regulations. Visitors must be approved in advance, must have legitimate reasons for their visits, and must be accompanied by authorized personnel at all times. I'm their husband. Not according to territorial law, you're not. Mixed marriages aren't recognized by the United States government. Those women are wards of the state under my protection and authority." Thomas leaned forward, his voice dangerous. "Let me make something clear, Daniels. Those women are my wives according to Apache law, which preceded your territorial regulations by centuries. Those children are my blood. I'm going to see them today." Daniels stood up, his hand moving toward a bell on his desk. "Mr. McClure, I think you should leave before I call for security." "Call whoever you want," Thomas replied, pulling out a leather pouch from his jacket. The clink of gold coins was audible as he set it on the desk. "But first, let's discuss the deteriorating conditions on this reservation and how a generous donation might help improve things." Daniel stared at the pouch, his attitude shifting noticeably. "What kind of donation are we talking about?" "The kind that ensures my family has adequate food, proper housing, and medical care. The kind that might fund improvements to sanitation and education facilities. Such donations would be appreciated by the Bureau," Daniels said carefully. "Of course, any improvements would benefit all residents of the reservation, not just specific individuals." Thomas nodded, understanding the game being played. "Of course, though I would expect to personally verify that my donations were being used effectively. That could be arranged. Regular inspections are part of proper oversight. Then let's start with a tour of current conditions, so I can assess what level of donation would be appropriate." Daniels pocketed the gold pouch and stood up. "I suppose I could provide a brief tour of the facilities." They left the office and walked deeper into the reservation. What Thomas saw filled him with horror and rage. The housing consisted of rough wooden barracks with inadequate ventilation and no privacy. Children played in dirt yards with no toys or proper clothing. Adults sat in whatever shade they could find, their faces bearing the expressions of people who had given up hope. "Where are the promised government supplies?" Thomas asked. "Delayed," Daniels replied vaguely. "Bureaucratic complications. You know how government procurement works." Thomas knew it was more likely that supplies were being sold for personal profit, but he kept his thoughts to himself for the moment. His priority was finding his family. They approached a section of barracks that housed families with mixed-blood children. Daniels pointed to a building near the end. "Your former associates are in there." Thomas walked quickly to the building and pushed open the door. The interior was dim and stifling, with families crowded into spaces barely large enough for one person. He searched the faces until he saw her. Morningstar sat in a corner, her once proud posture now bent with exhaustion and malnutrition. She had lost weight and her beautiful hair was dull and unkempt. Beside her sat Silent River, holding a small child who must be their daughter. Two boys, clearly Thomas's sons, sat nearby. "Morningstar," Thomas called softly. She looked up and for a moment didn't recognize him. Then her eyes widened with shock and hope. "Thomas," she whispered in Apache, then switched to English. "Thomas, you came back." He crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. They were thin and rough, worn by hard labor and poor conditions. Silent River reached out to touch his face as if confirming he was real. "I came back," he said in Apache, then English for the benefit of other residents who were listening. "I came back for you, for all of you." "We thought you were dead," Silent River said quietly. "Samuel told us you died in California. He said we had to leave because there was no one to protect us anymore." Thomas felt another surge of rage at his brother's lies. "I was never dead. I was working, earning money to expand our ranch and secure our future. I wrote letters." "We never received letters," Morningstar said. "Samuel said the Apache had no right to stay on the ranch without you. He said the government would kill us if we didn't leave peacefully." Thomas looked at his children, studying their faces. His sons had grown taller but thinner, their eyes holding a wariness that children shouldn't possess. His daughter, who had been barely walking when he left, was now a small person with silent, watchful eyes. "We're going to leave this place," he told them quietly. "All of us together." "Thomas," Morningstar said urgently, "they won't let us leave. They say we're prisoners here, that if we try to escape, they'll send soldiers after us." Agent Daniels, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. "Mr. McClure, visiting time is limited, and perhaps you should understand that removing reservation residents without proper authorization is a federal crime." Thomas stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt. "And keeping people confined against their will is also a federal crime, especially when they were removed from their legal home through fraud and coercion." "These people are here for their own protection," Daniels replied. "The territorial government determined that they couldn't safely remain in white settlements. The territorial government determined that my brother's political connections were more valuable than my family's rights." Thomas turned back to his wives and children. "I'm going to get you out of here. It may take some time to arrange legal authorization, but I promise you, we will be together again." He pulled out another small pouch of gold coins and pressed it into Morningstar's hands. "Hide this carefully. Use it to buy food and medicine for the children. I'll be back within a week with legal papers to take you home." Morningstar clutched the pouch, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, Samuel has powerful friends now. They tried to have us arrested for stealing when we first arrived here, claiming we had taken property from the ranch." "What property?" "My horses, the ones my father gave me as part of our marriage agreement. Samuel sold them and then claimed we had stolen them from him." Silent River added quietly. "He also took the jewelry and blankets my grandmother made for our wedding, said they belonged to the ranch, not to us personally." Thomas felt his determination harden further. Samuel hadn't just stolen the ranch. He had systematically stripped his wives of everything that connected them to their heritage and their identity as his family. "I'm going to make this right," he promised. "All of it." Agent Daniels cleared his throat impatiently. "Mr. McClure, visiting time is over. These people have work assignments to complete before evening meal." Thomas ignored him, speaking directly to his family in Apache. "Stay strong. Trust that I will return. Do not let them break your spirits. Morningstar responded in the same language. We have survived this long by remembering our life together. We will survive longer. As Thomas prepared to leave, his youngest son spoke for the first time. Father, will you really take us home? The word father in English, spoken clearly by a child who had learned the language while confined to this reservation, nearly broke Thomas's heart. Yes, son, I will take you home. Walking back toward the entrance with Daniels, Thomas made mental notes of everything he had observed. The overcrowding, the poor sanitation, the inadequate food supplies, the lack of medical care. All of it would be useful evidence in legal proceedings. Mr. Daniels, Thomas said as they reached the gate, I trust that the donation I provided will result in immediate improvements to my family's living conditions. Of course, Mr. McClure. The Bureau always strives to provide the best possible care for our charges. And I trust that no harm will come to them while I'm arranging their legal release. Daniel's smile was cold. Mr. McClure, accidents happen on reservations. People get sick, fights break out. Work assignments can be dangerous. We do our best, but we can't guarantee everyone's safety. The threat was clear. Thomas stepped closer to Daniels, his voice dropping to a whisper. If anything happens to my family while I'm gone, if they suffer any mysterious accidents or illnesses, I will hold you personally responsible. And Mr. Daniels, I've spent 3 years in California goldfields dealing with claim jumpers and thieves. I know how to handle men who threaten my family. Daniels stepped back, suddenly looking less confident. There's no need for threats, Mr. McClure. It's not a threat. It's a promise. Thomas mounted his horse and rode away from San Carlos, his mind already working on his next steps. He had seen his family's condition and confirmed that they were alive, but the reservation was even worse than he had imagined. The systematic cruelty and neglect were clearly intended to break the spirits of proud people who had once been free. As he rode back toward Copper Creek, Thomas began formulating a comprehensive plan. He would need Henry Blackwood to file legal challenges not just to his property ownership, but to the legality of his family's confinement. He would need to gather evidence of Samuel's fraud and the corruption of territorial officials. Most importantly, he would need to build public support for his cause among honest settlers who still believed in justice and fair dealing. The gold he had earned in California would be crucial, but not just for legal fees. In a territory where corruption was common, money could buy information, influence, and protection. Thomas was prepared to spend every coin he had earned to restore his family and reclaim his property. The sun was setting as he approached Copper Creek, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded him of Morningstar's traditional dress. He thought about his children's faces, about the wariness in their eyes and the hope that had flickered when they realized their father had returned. Samuel had stolen 3 years of their lives together, had subjected them to conditions that no family should endure, and had built his prosperity on their suffering. But Thomas was home now, and he would not rest until justice was served and his family was restored to their rightful place. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Thomas returned to Copper Creek as darkness fell, his mind churning with plans and strategies. The sight of his family's condition at San Carlos had strengthened his resolve, but it had also shown him the urgency of the situation. Every day they remained on the reservation was another day of suffering and degradation. He decided to take a room at the hotel despite the risks, needing a base of operations for what would likely be a complex legal and political campaign. The desk clerk, a nervous young man named Peters, recognized him immediately. Mr. McClure, sir, we weren't expecting you back so soon. I need a room for at least a week, possibly longer. Peters glanced around nervously. Sir, I should mention that your brother Samuel has been asking about your whereabouts. He seemed quite concerned about your welfare. I'm sure he was, Thomas replied dryly. What room do you have available? Room 12, second floor, facing the street. It's our best accommodation. Thomas paid for a week in advance with gold coins, noting how Peters's eyes widened at the sight of real money. Word would spread quickly that Thomas McClure had returned with substantial wealth, which might work to his advantage in negotiations. After settling into his room, Thomas walked to Henry Blackwood's office. The lawyer was still working by lamplight, surrounded by law books and documents. Mr. McClure, Blackwood said, looking up from his papers. I wasn't expecting you back so soon. How did your visit to the reservation go? Thomas sat down heavily, fatigue and emotion weighing on him. It was worse than I imagined. They're being systematically broken down, Henry. The conditions are deliberately harsh, designed to destroy their will to resist. That's unfortunately common on reservations. The government's policy is to force assimilation by making traditional life impossible. My children barely recognized me. My wives have been told I was dead. Samuel's lies go deeper than I thought. Blackwood set aside his papers and leaned forward. Thomas, I've been researching your case and I've found some interesting developments. Samuel made several mistakes in his haste to secure legal ownership. What kind of mistakes? First, the power of attorney he claimed to have from you was never properly witnessed or notarized. Second, his homestead claim was filed before the legal deadline for your land grant had actually expired, which suggests premeditation to commit fraud. Thomas felt a spark of hope. That's good news. There's more. I found 3 witnesses who remember Samuel telling them about his plans to clean up the ranch and make it more acceptable to territorial authorities. He was quite open about his intentions to remove your Apache family. Who are these witnesses? Jake Morrison is one. There's also Mrs. Elena Vasquez, who owns the boarding house where Samuel stayed when he first started courting Judge Patterson's niece. And surprisingly, there's Father Miguel from the Catholic Mission. Apparently, Samuel approached him about annulling your Apache marriages. Thomas stood up, pacing with renewed energy. That's evidence of premeditation. What else have you found? I've been corresponding with lawyers in Phoenix and Tucson. There's growing concern among honest legal professionals about the corruption in territorial administration. Judge Patterson isn't the only official who's been making questionable decisions in favor of political allies. Can we use that? Possibly. There's talk of a federal investigation into territorial corruption. If we can document Samuel's activities as part of a broader pattern of abuse, it might carry more weight than an individual property dispute. Blackwood pulled out a thick folder. I've also been researching the legal status of your marriages. While territorial law doesn't recognize mixed marriages performed after 1883, marriages that existed before that date are supposed to be grandfathered in. When were your ceremonies performed? 1881 for Morning Star, 1882 for Silent River. Then legally, they should still be recognized as valid marriages. The fact that Samuel removed them from their legal home could constitute kidnapping and unlawful detention. Thomas felt his spirits rising for the first time since his return. What do we need to do? We need to file multiple lawsuits simultaneously. Property fraud against Samuel, unlawful detention against the territorial government, and civil rights violations against several officials. We also need to document everything that's happened and gather as much evidence as possible. Money isn't an issue, Thomas assured him. What else? We need political support. Samuel has built his power through connections, but there are still honest people in the territory who believe in justice. We need to identify them and win them over to our cause. A knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Blackwood called out, "We're closed for the evening." "It's Sheriff Martinez," came the reply. "I need to speak with Mr. McClure." Thomas and Blackwood exchanged glances. Sheriff Martinez was known to be more honest than Deputy Crawford, but his loyalties were unclear. "Come in, Sheriff," Blackwood called. Martinez entered, removing his hat respectfully. He was an older man with graying hair and weathered features, someone who had seen enough frontier justice to understand the difference between law and legality. "Mr. McClure," Martinez began, "I want you to know that I've been hearing talk around town. There are some folks who think you should just accept how things are and move on. And what do you think, Sheriff?" Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "I think a man has a right to his property and his family, regardless of what some politicians decide is convenient. But I also think you need to be careful how you go about asserting those rights." Meaning? Meaning Deputy Crawford and his friends are looking for an excuse to cause you trouble. They want you to do something stupid so they can arrest you or worse. Thomas nodded. "I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. There's more. I've been asking around about your brother's activities while you were gone. Some of the things I've heard don't sit right with me. Such as cattle with altered brands being sold through his operation. Such as supplies meant for the reservation being diverted to his ranch. Such as territorial contracts being awarded to his business partners without proper bidding." Blackwood looked up sharply. "Sheriff, would you be willing to testify to these observations?" "If it comes to that, yes. But understand, I'm one man in a territory full of corrupt officials. I can't protect you from everything they might try." Thomas extended his hand to the sheriff. I understand, and I appreciate your honesty. After Martinez left, Thomas and Blackwood worked late into the night planning their legal strategy. They would file the initial lawsuits within a week, simultaneously in territorial and federal courts to prevent any single corrupt judge from dismissing the cases. They would also begin building a public case through the territorial newspaper, presenting their evidence to the court of public opinion. Many settlers had come to the territory seeking honest opportunities and fair dealing. They might support Thomas's cause if they understood the full scope of Samuel's corruption. As Thomas finally returned to his hotel room, he felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since his return. He had legal representation, evidence of fraud, potential witnesses, and the financial resources to sustain a long fight. Most importantly, he had seen his family and confirmed that they were alive and waiting for his return. But he also knew that Samuel wouldn't surrender without a fight. The confrontation that had been building since Thomas's arrival would soon come to a head, and when it did, only one brother would emerge with the property and the power that came with it. Thomas checked his revolver and made sure his door was securely locked before settling down for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he allowed himself to hope that justice was possible and that his family would soon be free. The confrontation Thomas had been expecting came 3 days later, but not in the way he had anticipated. He was having breakfast in the hotel dining room when Samuel walked in, accompanied by his fiancée Margaret Patterson and her uncle, Judge Patterson. Samuel had dressed carefully for the encounter, wearing an expensive suit and gold watch chain that proclaimed his newfound prosperity. Thomas continued eating calmly as his brother approached, but every muscle in his body was tense and ready for trouble. The other diners had grown quiet, sensing the drama about to unfold. "Thomas," Samuel said, his voice carrying false warmth for the benefit of observers. "I was hoping we could have a civilized conversation." "Samuel," Thomas replied without looking up from his breakfast. "I'm surprised you're brave enough to face me without Deputy Crawford watching your back." Judge Patterson stepped forward, his florid face showing indignation. "Mr. McClure, there's no need for hostility. We're here to discuss a reasonable solution to this unfortunate misunderstanding." Thomas finally looked up, his eyes cold as winter sky. "Misunderstanding? Is that what you call theft, fraud, and the unlawful imprisonment of my family?" Margaret Patterson, a thin woman with calculating eyes, spoke for the first time. "Mr. McClure, surely you can understand that the territory has changed since you left. We have different standards now, different expectations for proper society. Different standards like stealing from your own brother, like lying to women about their husband's death, like selling their personal property for profit." Samuel's face flushed red. "I saved what I could from a hopeless situation, Thomas. You abandoned your responsibilities to chase fool's gold in California. I didn't abandon anything. I built a business partnership that earned more gold than this ranch will produce in 10 years. Thomas stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "And I came home to find that my own brother had betrayed every trust I placed in him." Judge Patterson tried to reassert control of the conversation. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could discuss this matter in my chambers rather than in a public dining room." "Your chambers?" Thomas laughed harshly. "The same chambers where you rubber-stamped Samuel's fraudulent land claims, where you approved the annulment of marriages that territorial law says should be grandfathered. I don't think your chambers are particularly neutral ground, Judge. How dare you question my integrity?" Patterson blustered. "Your integrity?" Thomas's voice grew dangerous. "You want to discuss integrity with a man whose Apache family is starving on a reservation, while his brother profits from stolen property?" Samuel stepped closer, his own anger finally showing. "Those women aren't your family anymore, Thomas. Mixed marriages aren't legal. Those children are half-breed bastards with no claim to anything." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Every person in the dining room held their breath, waiting to see how Thomas would respond. For a moment it seemed like violence was inevitable. Then Thomas smiled coldly. "You know what, Samuel? You're right about one thing. This situation needs to be resolved. But not here, and not with your corrupt friends orchestrating the outcome." He pulled out a legal document from his jacket and set it on the table. "Henry Blackwood filed these papers yesterday. You're being sued for fraud, theft, conspiracy, and unlawful conversion of property. Judge Patterson, you're named as a co-defendant for corruption and civil rights violations." Patterson's face went white. You can't possibly prove such accusations. We have witnesses, Samuel's own statements about his intentions, documentation of irregularities in the land transfers, and evidence of kickbacks and illegal contract awards. Thomas picked up his hat and placed it on his head. We also have federal prosecutors who are very interested in territorial corruption. Margaret Patterson spoke up shrilly. This is preposterous. Samuel is one of the most respected men in the territory. Respected by whom? Corrupt officials and dishonest businessmen? Thomas looked around the dining room, noting that several honest settlers were nodding in agreement with his words. I think you'll find that many people in this territory still believe in honest dealing and fair play. Samuel's composure finally cracked completely. You self-righteous bastard! You think you can come back here and undo 3 years of progress? You think anyone cares about your Apache whores and their mongrel children? The room went completely silent. Thomas's hand moved to his gun, but before he could draw, Sheriff Martinez appeared in the doorway. That's enough, Martinez said firmly. Samuel, you and your party need to leave now. Sheriff, this man is disturbing the peace, Judge Patterson protested. The only disturbance I see is a man insulting another man's family in a public place, Martinez replied. That could be considered fighting words, which might justify whatever response follows. Samuel realized he had gone too far. This isn't over, Thomas. No, it's not, Thomas agreed. But the next time we meet, it will be in a courtroom where your money and connections won't help you. As Samuel's party left, the tension in the room gradually decreased. Several diners approached Thomas to express their support, including some he didn't recognize. Mr. McClure, said an elderly rancher named Bill Hawkins, there are more folks in this territory who support you than you might think. Samuel's been throwing his weight around, making enemies of honest people. I appreciate that, Mr. Hawkins. If you need witnesses to Samuel's character, or if you need help in other ways, just ask. Some of us remember when a man's word meant something. Over the next few days, similar expressions of support came from unexpected quarters. The territorial newspaper, initially hesitant to challenge powerful interests, began printing stories about corruption in land deals and reservation management. Several merchants who had been forced to pay kickbacks to secure government contracts came forward with evidence. Most importantly, a federal marshal arrived from Phoenix to investigate reports of territorial corruption. Marshal James Fletcher was known for his integrity and his unwillingness to be influenced by local politics. Thomas met with Fletcher in Henry Blackwood's office, presenting their accumulated evidence of fraud and corruption. Fletcher listened carefully, taking notes and asking pointed questions. Mr. McClure, Fletcher said finally, what you've presented here suggests a pattern of corruption that goes beyond simple property disputes. If even half of these allegations are true, several territorial officials should be removed from office and possibly imprisoned. What can you do about my family's situation? If your marriages were legally performed before the territorial law changed, and if your wives were unlawfully removed from their home, that's a federal civil rights violation. I can order their immediate release from the reservation. Thomas felt hope rising in his chest. When? I'll need to review the marriage documentation and interview witnesses, but if everything checks out, I could have release orders within a week. The week that followed was a whirlwind of legal activity. Federal and territorial lawsuits moved forward simultaneously, with witnesses testifying to Samuel's fraudulent activities and corrupt dealings. Judge Patterson attempted to dismiss the territorial cases, but Fletcher's federal investigation prevented any obvious manipulation of the legal process. Samuel tried various desperate measures to maintain his position. He offered to share ownership of the ranch with Thomas, then tried to claim that Thomas had been legally declared dead and that the property transfers were therefore legitimate. When legal maneuvers failed, his allies resorted to intimidation. But Sheriff Martinez and Marshal Fletcher made it clear that violence would not be tolerated. The turning point came when Agent Daniels from San Carlos Reservation was arrested for embezzling government supplies and selling them for personal profit. Faced with federal charges, he provided testimony about the entire network of corruption, implicating Samuel, Judge Patterson, and several other territorial officials. Finally, Marshal Fletcher arrived at Henry Blackwood's office with the documents Thomas had been waiting for. Federal court orders releasing Morning Star, Silent River, and their children from unlawful detention, along with a preliminary injunction restoring Thomas's property rights, pending final resolution of the fraud case. Thomas rode to San Carlos with the federal orders, accompanied by Marshal Fletcher and 2 deputy marshals. Agent Daniels had already been replaced by a new administrator who cooperated fully with the release process. When Thomas walked into the barracks where his family was confined, Morningstar looked up with the same mixture of hope and disbelief she had shown during his previous visit. "We're going home," Thomas said simply. This time, Morningstar's tears were tears of joy. Silent River gathered their daughter while the boys packed their few possessions. Other reservation residents watched with envy and hope, seeing that sometimes justice was possible even in a system designed to crush their spirits. The ride back to the ranch was emotional and triumphant. Thomas's children slowly began to remember their father and their former home. Morningstar and Silent River rode beside him, their faces showing relief and growing confidence as they left the reservation behind. When they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Thomas saw that Samuel's improvements had indeed made the property more prosperous, but it was still recognizably the home he had built. With his family beside him and legal vindication in his pocket, Thomas McClure had reclaimed not just his property, but his identity and his future. Samuel eventually pleaded guilty to fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. Judge Patterson was removed from office and faced federal prosecution. Deputy Crawford fled the territory rather than face charges for his role in the corruption. Thomas used his California gold to expand the ranch legitimately, building it into one of the most successful operations in the territory. More importantly, he rebuilt his family's life, helping his children recover from their traumatic experiences and ensuring that Morningstar and Silent River were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. The story of the rancher who came home to reclaim his stolen property and rescue his Apache family became legend throughout the territory, a reminder that sometimes justice prevailed over corruption, and that love and determination could overcome even the most powerful enemies.